It's time for a story about Utah, China, and a couple of religious guys with some serious connections. I mean, forget LinkedIn. These guys are going straight to the top. So we've got Greg Lee and Dan Stevenson, two Utah fellows with a deep affection for China. You'd think they were part of a long-distance dating show, but nope, it's all about the political influence. These guys use their faith to woo lawmakers and even scored some help from the Chinese embassy during a pandemic. It's like a rom-com, but with international intrigue. Not everyone's loving the blossoming romance, though. Some people think Greg and Dan are getting a little too chummy with the Chinese government, and they're raising eyebrows about their ties to groups that are all about foreign influence. It's like a bad reality show, keeping up with the Chinese diplomats. Dan Stevenson even tried to bring a little piece of China to Utah by helping a Chinese province build a ceramics museum. I mean, who doesn't want a ceramics museum in the middle of Utah? Unfortunately, it didn't work out. But hey, A for effort. These two aren't shy about using their connections either. They've got Utah lawmakers to star in videos for Shanghai TV to cheer everyone up during the pandemic. It's like the Oscars, but with politicians and a lot less glamour. But not everyone's buying into Greg and Dan's pro-China party. When some lawmakers tried to call out China's treatment of Muslim Uyghurs, Greg shut it down like a bouncer at a nightclub, telling them to turn to prayer and the Holy Spirit instead of biased media, because divine intervention solves everything. Folks, this Utah-China love story just keeps getting juicier. The closer Greg and Dan get to China, the more people start wondering if they've got a hidden agenda. It's like watching a political thriller, but with more Mormons and fewer car chases. Now Greg and Dan seem to have their fingers in a whole bunch of pies. They're working their connections like a telemarketer at dinner time. And nobody's quite sure what their endgame is. It's like a game of international chess, with Utah being the unsuspecting pawn. But wait, there's more. While some Utah lawmakers are getting a little uncomfortable with Greg and Dan's China love fest, others are starting to question if they're playing for the wrong team. The Justice Department is even getting in on the action, taking a long, hard look at this unlikely alliance. In the midst of all this drama, there's still some good old-fashioned politicking going on. Former Utah House Speaker Greg Hughes had a change of heart about his trips to China, saying it's a trip not worth taking. Sounds like someone's finally realized they're in over their head. So, as the Utah-China saga unfolds, we're left with more questions than answers. Are Greg and Dan just starry-eyed diplomats trying to build bridges, or are they unwittingly dancing with the dragon? And will this tangled web of international intrigue end with a bang or a whimper? As Greg and Dan continue their diplomatic dance with the dragon, the rest of the state is starting to wonder if they've lost their minds or just their moral compasses. While some Utahns are scratching their heads, others are scrambling to distance themselves from the China connection. It's like watching a bad breakup in slow motion. Everyone's trying to save face and keep their reputations intact, but it's getting harder and harder to tell who's playing who. You've got politicians, religious leaders, and even the Justice Department all trying to figure out if Greg and Dan are master manipulators or just gullible go-betweens. It's like a whodunit mystery, but instead of a smoking gun, we've got a couple of well-connected Mormons. Even as the drama unfolds, there are moments of levity. Remember when President Xi Jinping sent a note to those Utah fourth graders? It was like a scene out of a Hallmark movie. But the fact that even kids are being pulled into this saga shows just how far-reaching this story has become. As more people catch wind of the Utah-China connection, we can't help but wonder, what's next for Greg, Dan, and the rest of the Beehive State? Will they forge ahead with their China love affair, or will they finally see the light and cut ties with their faraway friends? Faraway friends. Like any good drama, there are new players entering the scene. The Justice Department has been snooping around, trying to get to the bottom of this curious connection. And you can bet that as the investigation ramps up, the pressure on Greg, Dan, and their China-loving cronies will only intensify. Meanwhile, the Utahns who've been watching from the sidelines are starting to get antsy. Some are calling for an intervention, while others are pleading with Greg and Dan to cut their losses and walk away from China before things get even messier. It's like a political intervention, but with more finger-pointing and a lot less empathy. But let's not forget about the real victims in all of this, the people of Utah. They're stuck in the middle of this international tug-of-war, unsure of who to trust and what to believe. It's like being caught in a bad episode of The Twilight Zone, where nothing is quite as it seems. As the tension mounts, we can't help but wonder if this Utah-China affair is headed for a dramatic climax or a slow-burning fizzle. With Greg and Dan finally woken up to the reality of it, will Greg and Dan finally wake up to the reality of their situation, or will they stubbornly stick by their Chinese comrades? As the spotlight on Greg, Dan, and their Beijing besties grows brighter, the pressure on all sides is mounting. You can almost feel the suspense in the air. It's like a political thriller, but with more temples and a lot less Tom Clancy. As the Justice Department digs deeper into this tangled web of diplomacy and intrigue, there's no telling what kind of secrets they might uncover. Will they find a smoking gun, or just a couple of overzealous Mormons with a penchant for Chinese culture? Either way, it's sure to make for some juicy headlines. The citizens of Utah, meanwhile, are growing more and more concerned. They're caught in the crossfire of this international game of cat and mouse, unsure of who to believe and what to think. It's like a real-life political choose-your-own-adventure book, but with higher stakes and no clear path to an ending. As the drama unfolds, the rest of the country is watching with bated breath. Will the Utah-China connection become a cautionary tale, a story of redemption, or just a footnote in the annals of political history? No one knows for sure, but one thing's certain: this tale has all the makings of a Hollywood blockbuster. So, my friends, grab your popcorn and settle in, because this Utah-China roller coaster is far from over. There's still plenty of intrigue, suspense, and political posturing to come. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the final act will be one for the ages.